So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Layla Levy, and I have a boutique travel concierge called Travel Design by Layla Levy. And since the lockdown, I've started running virtual travel series. And in the past couple of weeks or so, this is week number 15 of our virtual tours. And in the past couple of weeks or so, we've decided to explore Canada and showcase the beautiful country that we're living in. And we're so proud to call it home. So again, I am so happy that you decided to spend your evening with us and explore Newfoundland and Labrador, which is the most eastern province in Canada. So the goal of this presentation is to inspire and educate you about this destination, especially because right now, even us, we can't travel to Newfoundland and Labrador. And I still find that this is still a great time to learn about this destination and, put it on your bucket list. I wanted to ask you and challenge you with what does travel mean to you, and think about reflecting, especially right now, that we can travel actually. And at least, it's been the past few months or so, it's been, we're living in a very different world. And I wanted to remind you of Anthony Bourdain's quote, which is one of my favorite quotes actually, that says, "Travel isn't always pretty. It isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it hurts. It even breaks your heart, but that's okay. The journey changes you. It should change you. It leaves marks on your memory, on your consciousness, on your heart, and on your body. You take something with you. Hopefully you leave something good behind." And here is also information about my Instagram, and the same thing on Facebook if you want to follow me, Travel Design by Layla. And I briefly introduced myself, but I'll give you a little bit of more background for those of you who don't know me that well. My background is, believe it or not, actually engineering and analytics and tech world. And I left all of that because I was so passionate about travel, and I love to do that. And I started thinking about, I saw the need of personalized and customized vacation, and I didn't find that many people who are actually focusing on that space. So I started my own, and now I have a travel concierge business as well as full service travel agency. And my dream is actually to make a dream vacation for someone and make it happen and take care of all the details of that. I have a small team, but there's so much passion that goes behind tailor making and making it a tailor-made trip based on those preferences and whatever. We're all very different, and I believe that we need to travel differently, and we do travel differently. And again, as I mentioned, since the COVID situation, one of the things that I decided to do was to run virtual travel series. And we've traveled to, this week is week number 15. And we've traveled to Africa, to different parts of planet, to Antarctica. We had wine tasting in Spain. So we, traveled all these past weeks or so that we were all in lockdown situation. We've taken advantage of that, and we've actually traveled across the globe. And now that the world is opening up, there is certainly some lights at the end of the tunnel. But as I mentioned, I decided to showcase Canada and the beauty of this land, although we can't travel at this very time. And without any further ado, I want to introduce you to my very special guest. I let Ed introduce himself, but I actually asked him for a photo and for a headshot and bio And I think I let Ed to introduce himself. And I think, Ed, if you don't mind talking also about the Canadian signature experiences, because what happens is, Destination Canada picks few of the tour operators that are operating at a higher end level, and they are signature experiences of Canada, and showcase those. So I want to, Ed, pass it on to you so that you could introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Hello, folks. My name is Ed English. I'm from Newfoundland originally. Kind of like Layla, I came into tourism later in life. I used to be in the business world, and I had a fish plant at one point, and then I was in venture capital for biotechnology, and then just decided that I wanted to feature our province here in Newfoundland. So I started in that, back in the mid-90s, I guess it would have been, we started the tour company. So I've got a tour company, and under that tour company, I've bought a couple of lighthouses and turned those into inns, and I also have a Zodiac tour business. So we do a lot of hosting of people all around the province. I'm based on the west coast of Newfoundland. So near, if anybody's heard of much of Newfoundland, they probably know about Grossmore National Park. I'm from about an hour south of Grossmore National Park, and near one of the main airports for coming into to the province, which is Deer Lake. So yeah, that's basically what got me into the industry. And this year I'm doing virtually no tourism. So I'm tearing down buildings and building new buildings this year to take out my frustrations while I wait for the tourists to show up again. We're lucky in terms of the Canadian signature experiences. As Layla mentioned, what Canada did was they wanted to go around and highlight the top experiences in the country. So they select some in each province. And we're lucky enough to be one of those at our Lighthouse Inn, which we're going to talk about later. It's out on a deserted island up north, but there are several in the province, including a boat tour up through fjords, which makes you feel like you're in Norway, and a bunch of other experiences around the province have made it to that high level, like the Fogo Island Inn is another one. So the Canadian signature experiences is just kind of stamp of approval to say this is something you should not miss if you go. Kind of like the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, of which we have 4 as well. And I'm sure we'll touch on those as we get along through the process.
And it's my privilege to have you to talk to us about Newfoundland and take us to your wonderful, home region, I would call it. But let's dig in. So, you know what? I typically ask people to get a glass of wine and relax and just enjoy and learn all about the scenery. But today, I don't know if you had like iceberg beer from Newfoundland, probably didn't, but put yourself in this chair, sit back and relax as we're going to go to take this, take this beautiful tour around Newfoundland and Labrador. Just a little bit of, geography highlight in case you don't know where Newfoundland is. As I mentioned, is the most eastern province in Canada. And here is a little bit of zoom out version of Newfoundland and Labrador. And we're going and explore these, region and tell you about why this place should be on your bucket list and why it's important to visit those, some of those UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and what's special about Newfoundland and Labrador. It's an authentic destination, and in terms of time difference, I wanted to also mention that they're about an hour, 30 minutes ahead of us in Toronto. So I think right now at probably your time is a little bit like past supper for you, or a little bit later than for us and here. But Newfoundland and Labrador is a place where history and culture intricately and intrinsically melt. So there are 5 tourism regions in this province, and we're going to explore a little bit deeper. But first, let's talk about why Newfoundland and Labrador should be on your bucket list. So because it's the most eastern province in Canada, that's where you will see the sun's first beams of the day spread, coming to this country. And also, there are so much, as I mentioned, and we're going to go and talk about some of those in more details, but there is the history side and the culture that are mixed together. You see lots of icebergs floating in this off the coast, and Ed is going to tell us why and what is that. There is the iceberg alley that you see a lot of icebergs coming down towards Newfoundland. So we're going to talk about that. And I don't know if you know, but it's the most fantastic fjords in North America. Also, the first Viking settlement on the continent before Columbus reached and discovered the new world. In terms of activities and adventure, if you like to go on a hiking trail or to go on kayaking, or you really exploring the nature, snorkeling, dive tours, and all of that, that's a fantastic place to do it. And we'll be talking about some of those in more details. And, the same thing as wildlife. And we're going to talk about whale watching and puffins and seabirds and all of that. And Newfoundland is a great place for that as well. And one of the other things, I guess, that's so important for to travel to Newfoundland is we all are living through a very busy life. And Newfoundland is a fantastic destination to just unplug, just take on all these beautiful nature and take it all in. Back to culinary experiences, Newfoundland and Labrador is famous for its incredible fish, fishing villages and fish and chips, and they've got many, many restaurants serving fresh cod from the water. And one of the other things that actually I come across recently, there was an article by Forbes that said Newfoundland and Labrador has few restaurants as part of, under the radar culinary in North America. So there are great places to visit. And just a brief, kind of like going back to the history and culture, Newfoundland and Labrador, there are 4 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, 10 National Historic Sites, 9 provincial historic sites, and 3 provincial museums, and more than 150 community museums, and 19 designated wilderness and ecological reserves. So it's quite a bit of, heritage and culture embedded in this province. And Ed, feel free to jump in. You're the expert, and I certainly wanted to hear your thoughts as well. So feel free to jump in, whatever that you wanted to add, and correct me. Feel free to do so. In terms of what you need to know before going, so obviously there used to be a direct flight from Toronto or Montreal to St. John's and Europe as well. So it was quite an easy way of getting there. I'm just going to actually ask Ed to comment about the weather, because a lot of time we think that St. John's specifically is the windiest, coldest place, but I guess on the west coast, where Ed is, on the west coast of Newfoundland, the weather is quite, I think, like Toronto, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe like 3-4 degrees less than Toronto. So the weather is not as extreme or cold as a lot of it may assume it is. Ed, do you want to talk about the weather in Newfoundland? Oh, you're on mute.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was frantically pressing the unmute button, and it said, "You cannot unmute yourself unless the host lets you unmute yourself." Absolutely, yeah. The weather here, I mean, it comes partially just from the size of Newfoundland. Where I'm sitting right now, I'm as close to Boston as I am to the other end of my province. So you can imagine the change in weather between here and Boston. It's a similar sort of thing in Newfoundland. So, you know, if you're from Ontario or other places, an example I use is Point Pelee weather is very different from North Bay. And so when you hear about Newfoundland weather, unfortunately, what happens quite often is that people understand the weather because they hear the weather of St. John's. So when they go across the country, they do all the capitals quite often. And St. John's itself is in the midst of two major currents, the Gulf Stream, which is the warm water going up and heading towards Europe, and the Labrador Current, which comes down. And those warm water, cold water mixing in the air, the wet, the moisture, makes St. John's weather very foggy, windy, rainy, more exciting. Whereas when you come to the West Coast, we have more of the continental drift kind of air coming over us. So in the summer, all the warm, dry air comes off North America over the West Coast of Newfoundland. So it depends on where you are and which way the wind is blowing. You can be standing on the shore and it can be 22 degrees. And if the wind turns around and comes off the water, it can go to 8 degrees. So yeah, it's very variable, but it depends on where you are in the province.
And the other question I get a lot is like, what's the best season to visit Newfoundland and Labrador? And I'll get your thoughts, Ed, but I was going to mention that depends on what you wanted to see. So a lot of people are going to see, you know, icebergs in Newfoundland. And again, those like icebergs that are floating, which is quite a unique scene to see, or whale watching or bird watching. And depends on what of those stuff you wanted to see. Depends on, it will make that, you know, when would be a great time. But if you're going to see iceberg viewing, the timing typically is between April and August. And I think, Ed, you were saying that probably April still wouldn't be good enough because, yeah. So what are your thoughts on like when would be the best time for iceberg viewing?
Absolutely, yeah. The big thing most people want to see are icebergs. And that's the main determining factor of when you come to Newfoundland if you want to see those. May, June, July, as the further you go north in Newfoundland, the longer they last because the water is colder, it's further north and more arrive there. So you've got a longer season. So it's not unusual right up on the tip of the island to see some in August. But if you say, I have to see icebergs, then you should come in June or early July probably. Whales, they're around all the time. You may have to pick your spot. They're not in every spot in Newfoundland at any time. But during the season, once May comes, we'll start to see icebergs arrive at my southern lighthouse inn. And then when we close down in September, we still have we still have whales in the northern inn. So the whales aren't that much of a limiting factor. The birds, again, if you're a hardcore birder, you may want to come in the migratory seasons because this is a flyway for birds coming north to south, going to the Arctic and things like that. But the icebergs are the biggest determining factor on when you're going to come. And if the more you want to see, come earlier in the season. But April, it's not really tourism season yet because the icebergs are out there, but they're locked in the pack ice where the seals are and the polar bears are and things like that. So yes, they can be out there, but you can't access them very easily.
Fantastic. So moving on to a little bit of history of Newfoundland and Labrador and the fact that it's home to many different nations and backgrounds. So Vikings, Indians, Eskimo and English and French and Irish, they have all claimed Newfoundland and Labrador as hunting ground or home at some point. And today the province's capital, which is St. John's, lives on as North America's oldest English founded settlement. So that's quite, I don't think a lot of us actually appreciate as Canadian that how important or how old that part of Canada is. And you know, it's that's why that it's, I think, underappreciated or overlooked for a lot of people that are thinking to even like travel within Canada. Moving on to more of where this places exactly? So Ed, take us to Newfoundland and Labrador and tell us more about where is this place exactly?
Well, it is the easternmost point in North America. So if you're flying from Toronto or anywhere, New York even, quite often you pass over Newfoundland on your way. We're surprisingly close to Europe. I know when I've done travel shows in London, it amazes people when I say in 5 hours I can have you kayaking with an iceberg or looking at a moose, and they're just blown away that we can be that close. The northern tip of the province up in Labrador goes right up into the Arctic Circle, and that's where there are massive, massive mountains up there. So that's kind of the scale of it. The other way of getting here, if you're thinking about, okay, where am I and how do I get there? From Ontario, say Toronto, for example, you drive about 19 hours down to Nova Scotia, and then you get a ferry across to the southwest corner of Newfoundland. And then it's about a 12-hour drive, 11-hour drive to drive across the province. So we're closer to Europe than most people think, and we're not as far north as most people think. For example, if you land at Deer Lake Airport and drive about 15 minutes south, you're at the 49th parallel. So a lot of Newfoundland is actually below most of the Canada-US border. We're on St. John's, for example, is on about the same latitude as Paris. All of Ireland is north of us. So we're, because of the way it's called a Mercator projection, the way maps turn up on the edges, people think when they get a map of Canada, it turns up on the edges, so they think Newfoundland is north, but we're actually not very north at all.
And I guess the other misperception is a lot of people think that they can mix Atlantic Canada, so the three, the Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI, they can mix it with Newfoundland and Labrador, and they could certainly do that. But Newfoundland and Labrador probably would just need about 10, 12 days by itself to do a little bit of justice and visit that province. So if you wanted to really go for a longer trip, you can certainly do that. But it's most of the time, I think it's just a standalone destination by itself.
Absolutely. The people that mix it best are usually Europeans who have a month vacation. So the Dutch, the Germans will come over and have 4 or 5 weeks, and they will do Atlantic Canada. Mm-hmm. One of my biggest, most common topics in shows when I'm in Montreal or Toronto or Ottawa, somewhere like that, is we had 2 weeks, we thought we'd do the East Coast, and we got as far as Nova Scotia and realized we don't have time to go over. What's the point of coming to Newfoundland for 3 days? So it's quite often a conversation, but it's the last province we're going to. We've been to every other one, and the reason was we ran out of time when we tried to do the Maritimes and add Newfoundland, so we're doing our own Newfoundland Labrador trip now.
And it's the same size as California. So like imagine if you were going to explore California in like 3 days, it's not possible.
Exactly.
So so tell us more about, so Ed, you mentioned something about the currents, and tell us more about that, which I have this slide up.
You do have a slide, and my blood pressure probably just went up a little bit because the slide lies, and they've actually changed the slide in more recent versions, because this is actually the version of a little brochure the government hands out. So that white line that delineates Iceberg Alley, the icebergs come down. 90% of them come from the west coast of Greenland, and about 10% come off the east coast of Baffin Island. And after 2 or 3 years, they make their way down to Newfoundland and Labrador. And they come down on the current I mentioned earlier, which is the Labrador Current, and they will go all along the northern coast of Newfoundland, right from the tip where Lanson Meadows, the Viking site, is, right down to St. John's. And you've probably heard of the Titanic hitting an iceberg. The Titanic hit an iceberg in essentially the most southern extremity where an iceberg would ever be, right? It was just down past St. John's. Because normally when they go a bit down past St. John's, they get caught in the warm Gulf Stream that comes up from Florida and the Gulf and then heads over to Ireland, which is why Ireland and Scotland can grow palm trees and we can't. So it's that current that kills the icebergs once they go down a little past St. John's. So the reason this slide bothers me a little bit is if you see the white line going down towards the dark green patch on the west coast of Newfoundland, that's Grossmoor National Park. And you'd stand there with binoculars for maybe a century waiting to see an iceberg down in Grossmoor National Park. So in the more recent versions, they've erased about 3/4 of that line. The icebergs will sometimes go down what they call the Strait of Belle Isle between Newfoundland and Labrador, but the current there is predominantly north, so it usually spits them back out quite quickly. So if you're looking for icebergs, you want to go on that north coast, right from St. John's up to Lanson Meadows. And as I mentioned earlier,
Like
the later in the summer, the more north you need to go to find them.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent, excellent, cool. So tell us more about, like we briefly talked about the humpback whale, and one of the interesting things that when I was, doing reading more about Newfoundland and Labrador was I didn't personally know that there are the largest concentration of migrating humpback whales in the world are in Newfoundland and Labrador.
Absolutely, yeah. And I remember the day, I can still, it was in the early 90s when they declared the cod an endangered species. The cod went on the endangered species list as the same day the humpback whales came off the endangered species list, once they hit about 3,000 in the North Atlantic. So the whales spend their winters down in the Caribbean, and I just heard some interesting research the other day on different types of whales, but they may go down to the warm water to shed their skin and get rid of all of that. So it's like going to a spa. They were doing research particularly on killer whales, but they said they go down their skin is all yellow and covered and stuff. And when they're down there, they quickly lose their skin, they shed it and come back north and go on. So that it may be going down south for the winter to give birth, but it may also be going down just to get in the warm water and shed their skins. So the humpbacks come back up and then they surround Newfoundland and they spend the whole summer there. In the cove in front of my northern lighthouse, it's not unusual to have 6 or 8 whales right in the cove. Down at my other lighthouse, we also have not only humpback whales, but we get the blue whale, which is the biggest animal ever to exist, like bigger than any dinosaur. The tongue of a blue whale is the size of an African elephant. I mean, they're massive when they come up. And that's right down in the southwest corner of Newfoundland. And that's where they kind of hang out in the winter. Some people may remember about, let's say 5 or 6 years ago, 5 of them got crushed in the ice down there because it was a bizarrely cold winter. And the blue whales got stuck in harbors and couldn't get out, and the ice crushed them. So I know the Royal Ontario Museum has the skeleton from one of those that washed up in Rosemore National Park. So yeah, we've got great whales. The humpbacks put on the best show because they've got the big tails. The killer whales, a lot of people don't realize we have killer whales on the East Coast, but we see them regularly. And then we've also got about 22 species in general of dolphins and whales and things like that play around the coast. But pretty much anywhere in the season, like the summer season, you can find a boat tour that can get you to whales.
Do you want to?
Yeah. The Witless Bay Ecological Reserve is great for finding whales as well. It's over near St. John's, just to give people a feel for where it is.
And I also wanted to play one of the Zodiac tours that actually Ed run. Speaking of Iceberg Alley.
Oh yes, lots of bergs. We've got icebergs. I've had icebergs that it's more than 1 kilometer just to go around them. And that's not the biggest ones. There are some, it's unfortunate people can't come this year. We don't have a lot of icebergs this year, but some of them are miles long up north.
And I guess some of the traditions are icebergs are so plentiful around that area. And you also, I don't know how you guys do like iceberg water and iceberg vodka, gin and rum. And so I don't know how those stuff would work, but um, our iceberg watching is so popular in Newfoundland that there is a website called icebergfinder.com that sort of like tracks all this iceberg. So I think that's sort of like an interesting point about the iceberg alley and overall icebergs. And
Absolutely, yeah. It's fun having the icebergs come down because we thaw the ice out and drink it when you're staying at the inn. Where just that's the table water has got iceberg ice in it. I heard a little news item one day. There was a hotel in Ireland selling a liter of iceberg water for 40 euros. That iceberg is worth $1 million at 40 euros.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess the other interesting term that we all use a lot, which is it's because almost 90% of an iceberg is underwater, and that's why the phrase that we use, "tip of the iceberg," is so meaningful, because the majority of it is actually truly under the water. And that was another sort of like interesting point I wanted to make here, which is like this little thing that you can see here. Imagine the 90% of that is actually under the water. So if we have seabirds fan, or if seabirders or people who love to actually go and watch seabirds, where do they go at? And tell us more about the seabird capital of North America.
Absolutely, yeah. Depending on where the types of birds you want to see, there are a lot of ecological reserves around the island. There are islands you're not allowed to set foot on. Only researchers can go out on. The slide you showed earlier about Witless Bay with the picture of the whale there, that's an ecological reserve with some amazing bird colonies in it. There's one with the puffins. It's like 260,000 pairs of puffins. You go out in late September on a boat tour, they're apologizing that there's only 10,000 pairs of puffins still around, flying all around your head with capelin hanging out of their mouths. And that's a disappointing day to them. The slide you have up there now, that's Cape St. Mary's. That's an amazing spot for birds as well. That's a rookery there. That's one big, tall, about 100-meter rock. And there's like 20,000 gannet pairs and 24,000 pairs of murres and different kinds. So it's just a plethora of birds where you just walk out on the cliffs and they're nesting right in front of you. So it's very photogenic. If people are into birds, then we do tours and arrange to make sure people get the best birding. But even people that are like, yeah, birds, sure, whatever, are like jaw dropped when they go to places like Cape St. Mary's, just for the sheer spectacle of seeing that many birds and so close to you nesting. And it's been changing with the water temperatures and stuff, where they've been changing, the food supply has been changing. So it's been interesting for us, where I spend most of my time up north, to suddenly see the gannets and birds like that arriving in huge numbers that we didn't see 10 years ago. You'd see a handful, and fishermen say 30, 40 years ago, we couldn't have identified a gannet, and now we see thousands a year, or thousands per year. So it's an evolving kind of thing, where they are and where they're nesting. But whether you're a hardcore birder or whether you're just like a spectacle of nature, then there's lots of opportunity.
For sure. And I think it's just so fascinating to see 20,000+ birds and like hanging out to one rock. I think that's just like, seeing that scenery is just amazing. And there are other sort of like nature viewing in Newfoundland that is quite popular too.
Absolutely, yeah. The moose are not native to Newfoundland. They were introduced to Newfoundland, must have been about 120 years ago now, 115 years ago, and brought in as a food source. And they've done quite well to understate it, because there's about 120,000 now, and they issue about 30,000 licenses a year just to try and keep the population down. So we've got a huge moose population. It's changed a bit now. Grossmore National Park used to have an amazing number of them. My record driving through Grossmore was 52 moose in half an hour driving through the park. And now the park staff, the people who run it, have realized that the moose are actually destroying the park because they're not native, and they're in there eating the other animals out of their habitat and just trampling everything. So they've now allowed hunting in the park. So it's one of the rare things to allow hunting in the park. And that's brought the moose numbers down to a more manageable number in terms of population density in the park. But there's still lots of them around. There's lots of black bear. We have some of the largest black bear in the world, and they're great. You never hear of a problem with the black bear. I always say to people, you're under more of a threat from a squirrel than you are of a black bear in Newfoundland. I've never heard of an incident, but it's beautiful to go out and see them. Of course, if you go north into Labrador, we have polar bear. In the spring of the year, we get the polar bear. When you hear about the seal hunt in Newfoundland, most people are aware of the seal hunt in Newfoundland. That's because the seals are having their pups on the ice, and the ice drifts down from the Arctic to Newfoundland. So the water off northern Newfoundland doesn't freeze in the winter. But in the spring of the year, we talked about the icebergs being caught in the ice in April. It's not because the ocean froze there. It's because the ice drifted down from up north. And on that ice are the seals. And they're having their babies. And the polar bears are there eating the youngsters. So they're down all along the north coast of Newfoundland. And then when the ice melts, they come ashore. So we regularly get polar bears down April, May, and even into June. We'll have icebergs. Last summer, I think it was June 20 something, we had the last polar bear cross the island up by my northern lighthouse. Just walked across the island, jumped in, and then swam to Labrador, which is about a 30 to 40 kilometer swim, which is nothing for them. I mean, the record swim for a polar bear is over 700 kilometers. So it's part of their normal range. So yeah, there's quite a range. We also have coyotes, which made their own way over. And we used to have our own species of wolf, which were extirpated, just hunted back in the 1800s. But now the Labrador wolf is starting to reestablish its terrain in Newfoundland. So we're starting to get wolves back as well.
Excellent. So now, I guess with this slide, we wanted to give you a little bit of, deep dive into Newfoundland. And again, so the very first place we're going to visit is one of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the Grossmoor National Park. And I'm going to ask Ed to tell us more about this great place.
I've never heard of it. It's what you're seeing right there is Western Brook Pond Fjord. What happened on the west coast of Newfoundland about 10 or 12,000 years ago, the ice age ended and the glaciers melted and the west coast of Newfoundland bounced back, and it's still bouncing back. And all those fjords that the glaciers carved out to the ocean, some of them when the land rebounded became isolated from the ocean. So they're landlocked fjords is the term. So the water you're looking at in that slide, you can do a boat tour up through there, and it's amazing because as you come around the corner, the fjord just keeps opening up more and more and more. So when you're driving at the cliffs in the boat, you think, okay, it's a little bay, but then you'll wind your way in through it. So it's absolutely gorgeous. So yeah, it's a Canadian signature experience, which we talked about in the introduction. And there's a series of those. Some are still connected. The one where most of the towns are in Grossmoor on a bay called Bond Bay is still slightly connected to the ocean. And it's fascinating because of that, because just inside where it's slightly connected by shallow water is actually the deepest water in all of the Gulf of St. Lawrence between Newfoundland and Quebec and right up the St. Lawrence River. So what's happened is there are species of fish stuck in that deep water for 12,000 years that have never been able to swim up over the shallow water to get out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So they're actually evolving separately. So these fjords are amazing, not only for the spectacle, like when you come in through this one on the boat, you're looking up and there's waterfalls dropping 2,000 feet, and there's what they call hanging valleys, like valleys coming in from the side that just end and then have a 1,000-foot drop. So just visually spectacular, but it's also amazing from biological, geological. This is what they call an ultra oligotrophic lake. It has virtually no nutrients in it. So virtually nothing grows in that lake. And the water in the lake takes like a decade to turn over because the source is so slow and it comes off such nutrient poor land. So yeah, this is Western Brook Pond, an absolute icon for Grossmoor National Park.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is even like older than the Rockies, and it's 485 million years old formation.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, Newfoundland has some of the most amazing geology. If you go up into Labrador, the rocks there are 3.9 billion years old. It's some of the oldest rock on the continent. Gross Moor National Park is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of its geology. The other side of Gross Moor, and on the other side of the bay, which I just mentioned, Bond Bay, there's a piece of what they call the Earth's mantle there, and it's been driven up into a mountain, so it looks like Mars. You drive down the road, and it's Mars on your left, and it's Canada on your right. So it's amazing geology. The reason these mountains are lower than some younger mountains. Young mountains are high, and then over hundreds of millions of years they get ground down. So these have been ground down. So yeah, they're absolutely ancient rock, but still spectacular. Yeah, these are all shots. Those folks standing there, that's a good hike up there. About 20 years ago, a guy I know drove off there by mistake on his snowmobile and actually survived to tell about it. His friends assumed he was dead, but he managed to land in a snowbank about 500 feet below and walked out through the valley. And they'd gone home and reported him dead. Next day he walked out.
And you
And
could
that's
also cruise the freshwater fjords as well.
Sorry, what was that?
No, I'm just saying that you could also cruise
Yes,
through the.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's Western Brook Pond there. So to say, it doesn't look like much, but then it opens up as you go in.
Yeah, yeah. So this is our other second UNESCO World Heritage Site. Ed, tell us about Vikings in Newfoundland.
Absolutely. So that is right up on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Again, most people would find either St. John's or Deer Lake just to orient people. If you flew into Deer Lake, which is direct out of Toronto or whatever, then you would be 15 or 20 minutes to get to Gross Moor National Park to do the stuff we just talked about. And then about a 4-hour drive north will put you on the tip of the Northern Peninsula, and you'd go
Let
to
me
the
actually go back to the.
Yeah, so that's all half an hour. There we go. Yeah. So Deer Lake, you can see just in from the Bay of Islands. That's where you'd land, and then you'd go a little like 10 o'clock from there to get to Gross Moor National Park.
Yeah.
And you drive up the left-hand coast there all the way up to the top to get to the Viking site at Lanson Meadows.
Yeah.
So the Vikings were there. It's the only Viking settlement in North America. It's about 1,000 years ago. So 500 years before Columbus, the Vikings lived there for a few years. They came back in the summers, and then they abandoned the colony after a few years. But all the evidence is still there. They've reconstructed the sod huts. They have reenactors there. It's an amazing spot. Just the sod hut, you go, okay, it's a sod hut, but the whole scope of the kind of the migration of humans and how humanity worked, like when we left Africa, whether it was 90,000, 150,000 years ago, when humans came up out of Africa, some went right towards Asia, some went left towards Europe. And 1,000 years ago, those people that migrated the two different ways around the globe met again in Lanson Meadows. So it was essentially where humanity encircled the globe about 1,000 years ago. And it only lasted for a few years, and then they abandoned the community. But it's very well done. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a Canadian signature experience. So it's a powerful story just from the history of it. But it's also a neat spot to stand and go, why would you choose here? And to just, the reenactors will explain why they chose the northern tip of Newfoundland as their base. And it makes all the sense in the world when you realize they were using ships, not cars, to get around. So they were at the crossroads of 4 different coasts. And the way that they found that spot was because it's just south of a 30-mile long pure white sand beach in Labrador, which was described in the 1,000-year-old Viking sagas. And the researchers back in the 50s, they started in Florida trying to figure out where this beach was. And when they finally realized that it's not there, it's not North Carolina, South Carolina, it's nowhere like that, it's Labrador was actually where this 30-mile beach was. They discovered the sod huts in the evening just before the sunset because of the way the sun cast shadows over the remains of the sod huts. That's how they discovered this back in the late 50s.
So this is Red Bay National Historic Site, which is another UNESCO World Heritage.
Absolutely, yeah. We have 3 UNESCO World Heritage Sites within a few hours of each other. So to get to this one, you would, on your 4-hour trip north from Gross Moor to Lanson Meadows, You jump on a ferry for about an hour and a half and go left to Labrador. So you go across the Strait of Belle Isle, which is the chunk of water that separates us from Canada. And then you've got about a 45-minute drive to Red Bay. And it just became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Time sneaks up on you, maybe 5 years ago or something like that. And what it is, it was a Basque whaling station back in the 1500s. And whaling back then was an insanely valuable enterprise. I was asking one of the interpreters up there a few years ago, I said, what would a barrel of whale oil have been worth? And he said somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 for one barrel of whale oil, which explains why 400 or 500 years ago, only the very rich could have oil lanterns and things like this right? And they would use it for perfume and things like that. So this is, it was a totally self-sufficient little whaling station that the Basques set up there. And you can still see the evidence of where they carved the rocks out to render the oil down. You see their tiles, you know, the Spanish, Portuguese type red tile roofs. There's the remains of those. They found an entire ship buried in the mud from the 1500s at the bottom of the harbor you're looking at there now. They brought the whole ship up, did some research on it, and then they put it back down and buried it again because they just said that's the best way to preserve it. But they did keep one of the little boats that they would have rowed around chasing the whales in a little chalupa, and that's there in the interpretation center. So again, it's not spectacular, but it's just an amazing sight. And the other one that's even less spectacular, but I find just, and I don't know if you have a slide coming up about this, Layla, but it's the Maritime Archaic Burial Mound there. It's a 7,500-year-old burial mound for an indigenous child. And it's the oldest burial mound in North America. And you drive along the road and you get out and there's just a little plaque and a little, you know, a little spot where you stand and you see this burial mound. And it's so understated, it makes it more powerful to think that 7,500 years ago, people were doing ritual burials of children on that site. So your hair stands up when you're there. But as I say, there's no hoopla about it. It's just, oh my God, this is astounding.
Wow. Let's move on to some of the other provincial historic sites.
This is Point More. It's the highest lighthouse in Eastern Canada. So it's on the extremity of Labrador. If you were standing on the top of the lighthouse and you look east, you'd be looking over at the tip of Newfoundland. It's very famous for a ship called the Raleigh wreck there, which was the Pride. It was the massive, big British ship back in the early 1900s, a big warship, and they ran it aground there. And it was sitting there, and it was such an embarrassment that everybody that was coming to North America that came around the north side of Newfoundland to go up the St. Lawrence would laugh at the British Navy and how they left it there. So they finally came over and blew it apart just so that they didn't have everybody laughing at them every time they went past it back in the early 1900s. So the irony of it was this beautiful lighthouse that was started in the 1800s, and somehow the best of the British ships managed to still drive itself aground there while they were trying to come salmon fishing. Battle Harbor. This is an island that is a restored fishing village. Battle Harbor, if you do a lot of research, it's amazing. Like when people like Perry, the people that were first trying to get to the North Pole, this is where they were stationed. And not only them, but international media would be staying in Battle Harbor to report back on it. You know? So back again, 100 or more years ago, there would be reports coming out of Battle Harbor about Perry's latest attempt to get to the North Pole and things like that. So what you do is you get on a boat, you go out to this restored fishing village, and you can spend the night or two out there. It's absolutely spectacular. I flew out there one time with a tour company, and there was nobody around, and it was absolutely eerie to wander around on this little tiny island out in the Labrador Sea and just to experience what it would have been like with nobody else in civilization around you.
And I included Artist Provincial Park because I wanted to just, show you that there are endless picturesque coastal drives that you could do in Newfoundland and Labrador. They're beautiful, and this is just like a natural rock archway created by tidal action. So like every little spot of this place is just so beautiful. But tell us more about the Corner Brook. Where is the Corner Brook?
Corner Brook is just south of Deer Lake, about a half hour south of the airport at Deer Lake, so about an hour and a quarter from Grossmore National Park. I mentioned earlier about how the fjords were formed. So Corner Brook is essentially, it didn't rebound as much. So it's about a 30-kilometer long bay coming in to the end, and Corner Brook is in the, that's the town I was born in. It's the golf course just across the road from where I grew up. The slide may be in there because it's also a spot that John Cabot made note of. And if anybody's been to New Zealand and they drive through Newfoundland, they'll suddenly realize a lot of the towns have the same name, Hawke's Bay. This is the Bay of Islands. Corner Brook is on the Bay of Islands. There's a Bay of Islands in New Zealand. There's a Hawke's Bay in New Zealand. So this is where Cabot first got his credentials, shall we say, as being recognized as an amazing cartographer. The maps he drew of Newfoundland and the East Coast, particularly Newfoundland, but little other parts of the East Coast, were still the basis of the charts for shipping until like now. You know, if you've got an old chart like 10, 15 years old, it'll still say based on his charts. That's how good it was 400 and 500 years ago. So he explored everything, did an amazing job of it. If anybody's ever been to Hawaii, this is where Cabot started his career. He ended his career in Hawaii when he was attacked by the local indigenous groups and caught up. And his crew made an attack back the next day to try and get his body. And they knew they had gotten his body because right up on the tip of Newfoundland, he almost blew his thumb off, kind of like I did with my finger. He almost blew his thumb off one day, and there was a French warship there, and the doctor was able to sew his hand back together. And they found Cabot's hand in Hawaii when they recovered bits of the body, and that's how they knew they got his body back from the injury he'd gotten in Newfoundland decades before.
Those are fascinating stories.
Mm-hmm.
And now getting into the town of Gander, which if you probably, I think that I heard about it first when I watched the Come From Away show, and that may have been the case, or you may have heard this from, the September 11 and basically what happened there. But tell us more about the history of Gander, because I know that even after World War or before that, it was quite a spot for aviation in Newfoundland and Labrador. It was quite famous for that region before it becomes, I think, even more famous for after the September 11.
Absolutely. Gander was created because, first of all, again, to explain history a little bit, Newfoundland wasn't part of Canada until 1949. So during the Second World War, we were separate. But Newfoundland had a strategic advantage because it was so close to Europe. So in terms of planes, what was happening was the US and Canada were building a lot of planes, and they would try and ship them over to Europe to help with the Allies fighting over there. But the U-boats were getting them and torpedoing them. And so they said, maybe, can we ever think that we could fly across regularly enough to make it worthwhile? So they tried it, and they managed to fly from Gander and land in Ireland. So they said, oh my God, we can do this. So then it became, they call it Atlantic Ferry Pilot Memorial. So it was called Ferry Command. So all the planes that were being built would arrive in Gander or Goose Bay in Labrador, most of them in Gander, and then they would get them ready, and they'd make the jump across the ocean over the top of the U-boats and land on the other side. So it became hugely, I remember hearing it was the busiest airport in the world at one point, because of all the planes going through it. So it became very strategic during the Second World War, and it was created just essentially for that purpose. And then after the Second World War, it was still a very, very important airport because planes didn't have such a long range. So stuff coming from Russia or anywhere like that, Eastern Europe, would have to land in Gander to refuel before they went on anywhere. So we used to have, and that's not ancient history. I mean, when I was a kid, which maybe is ancient history to some, was people would defect all the time in Gander, come over, land, defect, and become Canadians. And we still have people living in Newfoundland who defected in Gander on a flight from Russia or from Cuba or wherever it was. So that was important back in the 50s and 60s. Then once the range of airplanes got better, Gander kind of faded away. The airport itself is actually the best example of an Art Deco airport that's been undisturbed. So people that are into architecture will make a trip to Newfoundland just to see Gander Airport itself and the International Lounge because it's so untouched. So architecturally, it's significant. Then it jumped back into significance back in 9/11, obviously, when the US said airspace is shutting down, and Canada said, okay, we'll take all the planes Gander was the place where most of them landed. So it almost doubled. The town's 10,000 people, and it almost doubled the size of the town. So suddenly 10,000 people were poof, landed, or 8,000, whatever it was. And they had to spread out into all the neighboring communities, and they were there for a long time. And Gander became very well known because of that. So this Come From Away, if you haven't seen it, it's a fabulous show. It's been, it's won Tony Awards. It's been on Broadway. It's in London now. So it travels the world telling the story about all those people. And the friendships that were made because of that have gone on since. The people that were coming and were hosted by locals, just, take over our bedroom. And they were there for a week or 2 weeks. And now they're still friends from around the world. And it was interesting, just as a side note, the other airport where a lot landed were in Stephenville, which is on the West Coast, just south of Corner Brook. And we had an inn there, and we got a call saying, we're reserving all your rooms, and we'll let you know. This was on 9/11. Once they realized, okay, all these planes were landing, we got all these people stranded, we'll let you know who's coming and when. So the next morning, about 5 a.m, we got a call saying, okay, get ready, we're starting to bus people to your inn. And they finally showed up about 12 o'clock, and they got off the bus. And this included the crew of the plane saying, A, where are we? And B, why are we here? They had actually landed the planes in Gander and Stephenville, places like that, with no information. They just said, land, stop, and didn't let anybody off the plane for 24 hours. And they still had no idea why they had landed. They got them in a bus, drove them for an hour, and when they got out, they still were going, where are we? They didn't even know they were in Newfoundland, and they had no idea why they landed. So you can imagine how upset the average person now would be if you just were told sit on that plane for 19 hours or 21 hours or 24 hours. But that was an amazing story, and how it all worked out and all the friendships that were made. So we still get a lot of people coming just wanting to visit Gander, to see the spot where most of the planes landed.
I watched a few documentaries on that, and it was so fascinating to watch all those, the friendships and the moments and all, it's just like fascinating. So I encourage you all to watch more documentaries on the Gander and what happened basically on the 9/11 Gander thing off YouTube or some other places. That's fascinating. But let's go faster, because I wanted to talk about the culture, the heritage side, and the food, and other interesting stuff as well. So let's go a little bit faster, Ed.
Okay. Then I won't say anything about this. This is Twillingate up on the north coast, halfway across the island. It's a very popular town for tourism. It's got the Long Point Lighthouse. It's got a lot of, you mentioned earlier about walking trails and things like that. Some of the walking, we haven't even talked about activities really in our presentation. But Twillingate has beautiful walking trails and everything around it. It's got a replica of Cabot's ship, the Matthew there. So yeah, no, it's well worth a visit and very popular. This, along with another one called Trinity and Bonavista, those are the three kind of jewels along the north coast. And there's Trinity. Trinity is probably the best example of a town that has taken all the old houses, and that area of Newfoundland historically had a lot of money. It wasn't where the poor fishers lived, it was where the fish merchants lived, who were making the money off it. So there were a lot of nice houses, a lot of nice churches, a lot of nice buildings there, and they're being redone very well now. If you want like really nice handmade chocolate or soap or that kind of stuff, and you want to see a traditional little Newfoundland village done up like a little jewel, that's the one to go to.
Sorry, give me 1 sec. Okay, sure, sorry.
And that's the Ryan premises, yeah, and Cape Bonavista. So that's the Ryan premises is a National Historic Site. It's a fish merchant, where I just talked about the people that would have made all the money. So they preserved all the premises where they would have brought in the fish, how they would have processed the fish, how they would have sold it, got it ready to ship, and sent it out. So that is in Bonavista, and a beautiful little operation done. And right next to it is a great heritage hotel and restaurant right on the water. This is the Wooden Boat Building Museum. The Newfoundland is working very hard to save the heritage, not only the actual heritage of what was built, but how to build things. So the Wooden Boat Museum, you can go in and you can learn how to build a boat. You can help participate in building the boat. The heritage is also preserved in just in stories. So there's a whole what's the word, ephemeral kind of heritage that they're trying to preserve, the tales, the stories, and all that. But the Wooden Boat Museum is an amazing thing to go in just to see the difference in all the little boats, how they work, the different sizes, how they were adapted to each bay would have waves that would react differently. So you designed your boat to work in the little bay where you live, and it might not be the best boat for the next bay over.
And this is actually one of the other UNESCO World Heritage Sites that I am very fascinated by it. So tell us more about the Mistaken Point Ecological Reserve.
Absolutely. If you're looking at the map of Newfoundland, this would be far over on the right and down on the bottom. And this is the latest UNESCO World Heritage Site for Newfoundland. So these are the oldest multicellular fossils. So it's, what's it, 400 and some odd million years old, I think it is. I might be wrong about that.
500 something.
Sorry, what?
Over 500.
There you go, over 5, yeah, I think 480.
Yeah.
So the fossils down there are absolutely astounding and prove the way life began. And it's kind of a neat one to go to because they haven't fully told the story yet. So I like it. It was only 4 or 5 years ago, people were still trying to chisel the fossils out of the rocks and steal them and sell them on the open market. And they started to clamp down. And that's one of the things they said, we've got to make this a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We've got to get the recognition so that we can preserve such a valuable site. So yeah, that's right over in the bottom right-hand corner and well worth the trip. It's just down from the Babels and Witless Bay ecological site we talked about where all the puffins and things were.
Yeah, so like one of the things I love about this is, the fact that the fossils have been preserved for study, but still can be viewed on an official tour. The tour is about 45 minutes or so, but that needs to be, well arranged in advance. Just making sure that they're completely doing preserving, and so once you get there, you'll have to wear this like special booties to help preserve the surface, and it's so interesting to visit this UNESCO World Heritage Site in Newfoundland. And next stop, we are going to the beautiful, colorful St. John's, which is the capital of Newfoundland and Labrador province. So tell us more, Ed.
The oldest city in North America, the oldest English city that was established there because it was so close to England. All of Newfoundland, the British fought over it with the French, the Irish were there, the Basque were there. Of course, before that, the Maritime Archaic were there, the Paleo-Eskimo were there. All of those cultures swished around Newfoundland in various forms or the other. St. John's is a beautiful old city. The waterfront is lovely. You can walk right down on it. It's not a Disney-fied waterfront, shall we say. It's still an active waterfront. So you're down there where even when I was a kid, the Portuguese white fleet would still come over fishing. And they were painted white because Hitler agreed, if you paint your ships white to the Portuguese, we won't sink them if you're just going fishing. So they painted all their ships white. So the white fleet would still come to Newfoundland back when I was a kid. And there's still all the fishing boats coming in and out of there. But next to that are all the offshore oil rig service boats, which are just, it's like a workhorse, these massive Clydesdales next to a pony, just seeing these massive big working ships. And the cruise ships come in, and you can't believe they could fit through the little crack because St. John's is a beautifully protected harbor. During the Second World War, they would have nets across to keep the U-boats and everything out because it was such a great harbor. If you could get into St. John's, you knew you were safe, and you still know you're safe. And the city itself, the building up on the top there is the rooms. That's the big museum and interpretation center and art gallery and everything that was developed maybe 10 or 15 years ago now. So it's well worth the visit to go. It tells a lot of the history of Newfoundland and St. John's in particular. Downtown. So yeah, no, absolutely. This is Water Street, downtown St. John's. So lots of good restaurants, little shops. St. John just comes alive at night. They've just declared with the COVID year, one good thing is there wouldn't be a car there if you were there now. they've closed off a lot of Water Street, and it's pedestrian now. So where you're not allowed to have as many people in your restaurants, they just said, let's close the road, and everybody come out on the road, grab your chair, grab your table, come on out, and carry on life as normal. So it's turned into a pedestrian thing for 7 hours a day now, which hopefully will continue on. But it's a beautiful walk, and most of the hotels are in that area. The Botanical Gardens, yeah, it's amazing. You know, people again don't understand the climate of Newfoundland, but what can be grown here. For example, we have 47 species of orchids in Newfoundland. You know, I mean, we got beautiful orchids and things like that. So if you're into flowers and plants and growing, then it's well worth going to the Botanical Gardens in St. John's. It's just gives you a feel for the full scale of what's available. The Johnson Geo Center is like a 10-minute walk from downtown St. John's, and it not only talks about the geological parts of Newfoundland, and it's underground. What you see in there is just the entrance kiosk, and then you go poof underneath, and you're down in caverns essentially, exploring the geology. But it's far more than that. When I bring people there, the display on the Titanic is what gets most people. Just all the history of the Titanic and the details of that, because Newfoundland is where the signal came ashore from the Titanic that they were sinking. It was the only radio signal received was in Newfoundland. And that's looking out the harbor entrance. As I mentioned, you can see one of the boats on the left there, one of the oil supply rigs, and the building right on top under the L of NL, that's Signal Hill. So that's where Marconi got the first transatlantic signal, came across to there, and that's allowed news to travel the world. It was before that, it was a transatlantic cable. So a cable came from England over to Newfoundland before that in the 1860s. And this replaced it by saying we can do it wirelessly. So that's why it's called, one of the reasons it's called Signal Hill. They also used to fly the signals from there, like flags, to show different signals. And very popular to do that walk up there. And then you drop down off the edge there, and there's beautiful walking trails just along there. And anywhere you're walking there, you look out to sea, very good chance you're going to see whales while you're walking.
Speaking of food.
Lobster. As we're sitting here while we've been on, I've been watching the lobster traps go past my house here. The lobster season is starting to end now, so they're pulling all their traps and moving on to cod and halibut and things like that. See, I know the food here, a lot of people want to come down and try the traditional things at Jig's Dinner, the pan-fried cod. My neighbor just brought over fish cakes for me for supper just before we got on the call here. Just beautiful. I couldn't wait. She said, oh, I got fresh cod. You want me to make you some fish cakes? Yes, please. So it's absolutely wonderful. Downtown St. John's, I'm going to say 6 or 7 years ago when the oil money was still booming, St. John's had 3 of the top 10 restaurants in Canada. Like that's how much for a town of 125,000 people. So if you're into food, bring it on. And if you're into like good alcohol, there's a lot of microbreweries started up now, brew pubs all over the place. So if your main reason for going for walking and biking and kayaking is so you can justify having a good beer and stuff afterwards, yeah, we can do that as well.
And one of the things that I always recommend is go on those like unique food experiences and food tours. And there is this particular restaurant called Cod Sounds that they have this like cookery school that, you know, what they do actually, it's quite fascinating because they don't just give you all the ingredients. So they've got different kind of experiences. So they've got some of the experiences you have to actually go. So it's about, you know, finding all those ingredients or taking that skills and the knowledge that you need to basically put up that fire, or you need to do all of these stuff. So there is a lot of like skills, like fire crafting and tracking and hunting and fishing and shelter building and all of that stuff that goes through basically that meal, which to me is fascinating because now we think we take everything for granted. Now we think that, you know, it's just easy, but they basically take you back to the old way of doing it, and they've got several experiences, which is very, very unique. I don't know, Ed, if you want to add anything to that.
Absolutely, it's becoming more popular now to to utilize what's available and what's grown here. Like up at our inn up north, we pick all the berries on the island. We'll use some of the plants. The Inuit have showed me some of the plants they eat, so we actually use those now. So it's become very popular not only on land but also in the sea. You know, there's easy stuff, you understand, cod and things like that, but we're seeing more use of like the sea urchins and the seaweed and kelp and things like that. So yeah, the full range of food has grown. And there's one called the bake apple. I'm not sure if you have a picture there or not. And we talked about it earlier. Yeah, there you go, bake apple. So that's a very kind of unique berry for Newfoundland in that you only get one berry per plant. It's got a taste that you either love it or you hate it. And it grows in really specific areas. So it's got to have just the right moisture, usually in slightly boggy areas with cooler kind of flow around it. It costs about $70 a gallon to buy them. So they're very expensive. So if you order like a bake apple cheesecake or something, you know, you're getting the best, right? Other places, people may have heard of cloudberries, like in Norway or Finland or something, they would call them cloudberries. And they're used as well now in making liqueurs and things like that. But there's those, and the iceberg beer, that's the other popular one. I had a tour come in, a family come in. They came in on their own private jet to come up to the lighthouse for a few days. And when they left, all they took with them was about 10 cases of iceberg beer. So we got to take that back. So this beer is just a basic beer, but it's made from iceberg water and in a very photogenic bottle, as you can see. And it's called, the name of the company, it looks weird, but it's called Kitty Vitty. Kitty Vitty is like a little tiny fishing village encapsulated in St. John's. So St. John's is a city, but you just go down in this 5-acre kind of little spot is like this ancient little fishing village still. And they've got the brewing company down there and a little artists kind of colony as well down there. So it's a really neat spot to go down to Kitty Vitty if you're in St. John's. Absolutely. In terms of, yeah, poetry, humor, song, all of that. Newfoundland, if you follow literature at all, for example, you know, if you Canada Reads or the Governor General's Award or whatever, they'll always say Newfoundland is far overrepresented when you pick authors for books, for prizes and things like that. And the music that comes out of here is just so eclectic. I tell guests, you can just go down on George Street, which is the street that's just lined with bars and then blends into Water Street. You can just stand there in the evening and just listen to which type of, 10 music that you hear, that you just go, okay, I like the sound of that. That's the sort of music that appeals to me. And you just pick your little bar and you go in and it's a little pub or whatever. And you're having just a beautiful little musical experience there. I just remember hearing, John Prine, everybody knows him. He's so famous. He died a few weeks ago, was it, or a month or two ago? And he was up playing in St. John's, and there was a local guy who died a few years ago. He wrote, if anybody knows the song Sonny's Dream, Sonny lives on a farm, and that song Willie Nelson and people like that recorded. But they went down, and John Prine and his band, they were in this little hole in the wall pub and went in, and this local musician was playing called Ron Hines, and they actually wrote a song about hearing Picasso play because they just were blown away by the quality of the music they were hearing when they were in that particular pub with him. But yeah, if you're into culture and music, and it's not only in St. John's, the theaters in places like Trinity, I mentioned that little jewel of a town that's restored all its little theaters and houses and everything properly. Fabulous theater there. Gross Morn has theater that literally travels the world. It's not high school students putting something off. It's theater that goes to Edinburgh, that goes down to Tasmania, that goes down to the US, and that's what they do in their off season. So world-class performances. It's not just downtown St. John's, it's everywhere. And it's very, very broad-ranging.
And the traditional music of Newfoundland Labrador it has some sort of like Irish, Scottish, English, and French music sort of combined all together. So I think it's sort of like very interesting mixture of music from different regions.
Absolutely. It's funny you should say it because we were sitting at one of the lighthouse inns the other day, and I said, we've got to create a playlist that we can put on Spotify or something for people, because I get asked all the time, what CD should I buy? And I say, well, I don't know what type of music you want, because there is no, this is Newfoundland music. It's such a broad range. So I'm going to create a playlist so people can go on and say, okay, listen, I like that type best. Okay, then go buy that CD.
And tell us also about some of the famous festivals that we may want to, do our timing correctly so that we be there for those festivals.
Absolutely. It depends on your theme. For example, Gross Moor National Park has one early in the summer, in mid to late May, and it's called Trails, Tales, and Tunes. So it's go out, walk the trails, hear some recitations and stories, and lots of music. And, that's a great theme if you're an outdoorsy, and, everything is going to have food and local beer and local wine and all that included as well. But then you can do just like on George Street, the George Street Festival is all about music. So then there's up north in the northern tip of Newfoundland, there's the Iceberg Festival that comes in early June. So if you want to do iceberg theme, so yeah, there's no time other than this year that you would come and not find a festival, lobster festival. I was in, it was Toronto or Vancouver, and the lady said, I want to come down on a tour, and it's about eating lobster. She said, I want to come down for about a week, and I just want to eat lobster. I want to eat the best lobster. Wherever I need to go, I will go, and I just want to eat really good lobster. Because she's from Nova Scotia, and she said, I know Newfoundland lobster is a lot better than our lobster in Nova Scotia. And she said, I love it. So just, she said, I want to do other stuff. But my main theme is every day, make sure I have the best lobster that I can find as I'm moving around. So that was, I was going to include her until things got canceled in the lobster festival in one of the towns as well. That's the easternmost point in Newfoundland, so it's just outside St. John's. That picture you're looking at, that headland over there, if you look left from there, you'd be looking right in the harbor at St. John's. So that's the most easterly point in North America. That's where the sun rises first. There's a beautiful lighthouse there. Myself and my girlfriend were out walking there last year. There were whales jumping just offshore, and it's part of the East Coast Trail. Again, we haven't talked much about activities, but it goes for hundreds of kilometers along the East Coast. You can just pick which section you want to do each day and just walk from town to town. And one of the most beautiful sections is leaving there and heading, right from that lighthouse and heading down to the next little cove called Paddy Harbor. Or you can just run up and down those steps all day if you want to.
Yeah, I'm just going a little faster in these ones, but I guess we sort of like made the point that this is the place that you'll see the first beams of sunlight coming into Canada. And so speaking of again, let me actually, yes. So we've talked about one of the, Canadian signature experiences, which is actually one of the lighthouses that is owned by Ed. So Ed, I don't know if you want me to first play the video or you want to talk about it, but that's, I guess, a place that we all need to put it on our bucket list because it is a Canadian signature experience.
Sure, go ahead, play the video if you like, and then I'll get a feel for what that may have missed.
Speak over it as well.
Well, it's right next to Lancha Meadows. It's on a deserted island, 7 kilometers long, right on the northern tip of the island. Beautiful hiking. The lava section. Go on to 5 first. Star Inn, we take you out by Zodiac out to the island. You can get dropped off in the near end of the island and do a 5.5 kilometer walk along the cliffs and get to the Lighthouse Inn. It's then there's 10 rooms, there's 2 buildings. We have, as you saw, a whale watching station, which is just a glass room. We've got the helipad you can see there in the picture. So a lot of people just spend their time sitting out on the helipad. Just out of that screenshot now, back about 200 meters, I've built an all glass building hanging out off the cliff. So you step off the cliff, you walk out on a glass floor inside a little, what we call the iceberg nest, and below you, the whales come right into the cliffs and the icebergs go by. And I've got a king size bed in there and 2 captain's chairs. So you just walk out on a glass floor over the ocean, dangling off the cliff, and sit and watch whales and icebergs. And then at night, you've got a king size bed and the whales swim right underneath you, Northern Lights going overhead.
It seems like you need a new video to be made, Ed, because I wasn't aware of that, the new construction, but that's fascinating.
It's just being finished now. We actually installed the bed, but we haven't put like the mattress and things on it, so it's not photogenic yet.
Fantastic. Yeah, so exciting. And then the other unique property that you have, it's Cape Angle Lighthouse Inn. So let me play the video and maybe you tell us more about that afterwards.
Sure. I see non-COVID approved crowding around the supper table there.
Yes, I was actually going to ask you, so how are that, well, given Newfoundland opens up for tourism, what are your plans in terms of making it COVID proof?
We're only open certain number of rooms. We've like the Lighthouse Inn up north isn't going to open this year. There's just not enough business. You can't justify trying to open up an island and docks and boats and insurance and all that. So it's just not worthwhile. This one is in the southwest corner, as people saw. So we may get some traffic with people coming and going on the ferry back and forth to Nova Scotia. So we're giving that one a try. That's where I spent the day actually just down doing some maintenance work down there. Yeah, so we're just not opening all the rooms. We're only opening on selected days. We're very lucky because we've got 2 different buildings with a bunch of different entrances, so people can come in different ways and things like that. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I've essentially written off this year and now thinking about like, what's the plan for next year? All the hope is for next year, not for this year.
Yeah, yeah. So that's it pretty much. I guess one of the slides, basically the message here is tell about this experience, this trip that you had to Newfoundland and Labrador with 10 other friends, and tell them about the most eastern province of Canada And here is my information if you wanted to share comments, feedback, and if you wanted to learn more about it, or even if you want to inquire about next year trip to Newfoundland and Labrador, this basically reach out to me. But in terms of what's in the plan for next week, we'll be going to Prince Edward County, not Prince Edward Islands, which is about 2 hours away from Toronto. It's a destination for culinary, wine tasting, biking. So it's a wonderful place in Ontario, not too far from Toronto, and that's where we'll be exploring for next week. But I want to open up for questions, and let me stop. And then we'll see if you have any questions. So if you have questions in that, please put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself as well. So, okay, I have some questions. So I've really enjoyed it and very keen on planning a trip to Newfoundland. Well, when will it be safe to go and how will we get there? I would only go for 1 week max, as I can leave my business for much longer. Can we go this summer? So what happens now is actually, so we can't travel from Ontario to Newfoundland. And so we have to wait until the province allows us to travel to begin with. But I personally believe that if that's happened, there is a good chance that a lot of people would go later summer. I don't know, Ed, what are your thoughts about, safety? Because I guess you guys closed down Newfoundland for pretty much right after, I don't remember the dates, but like you don't even have that many cases to begin with, and that's why that you're super cautious with not allowing people from other provinces or other countries in.
Yeah, I think I might be wrong. I think we've been 41 or 42 days without a case now, so we are COVID free. I mean, you're as likely to catch, I don't know, tuberculosis or the Black Death or something here now as you would be to get COVID. So yeah, in terms of coming here, you'd be perfectly safe. The concern, of course, locals are worried. They want to take it down to zero and keep it at zero. The government is taking more of a no. We've got to learn to live with it. So they've opened it up to Atlantic Canada, and there's some hope that on the 17th is kind of what they were tossing out, that they may open it up to all of Canada. So absolutely, if you get a chance, come. The person asking the question mentioned a week. Normally we say if you have a week, don't try and do all of Newfoundland, either do the West Coast or the East Coast. So do the Grossmorn, Lanson Meadows, Vikings, that kind of, or do the St. John's, Trinity, that corner over there. So yeah, that would be my advice. In terms of getting here, Air Canada and WestJet are opening up flights again now, so you can get into Deer Lake or St. John's, and that, depending on which coast you want to go to, make sure you pick the right airport. Yeah, so and you can do the ferry as well, but as I say, depending on where you're coming from, it's further than most people think. So if you only have a week, then I wouldn't suggest trying to drive from Ontario, for example. You're just going to spend, well, essentially your week driving back and forth. So you're better off flying into either Deer Lake or St. John's. But yeah, if they'll let you in, by all means come, because it's perfectly safe to come here. And we're so spread out.
And one of the things that I actually advised sort of like my clients and my folks is even for next year, and as I personally planning for my next trips, I would be picking places that are less crowded, less busy, more nature, and Eastern Canada would be perfect for that, because you can literally go on wildlife tours, hiking, road trips, and all of that with full social distancing, sort of like in things that you need to consider. And I guess Newfoundland Labrador would be a perfect place to put on your bucket list. If it isn't, I hope that it is right now after this wonderful presentation. And okay, so some other questions are about the best time to go to see, if they wanted to do the birds, whale watching, and And I think it would be probably June to August, I would say, that you would see whales, birds, icebergs, all of them at the same time. And I think it's just a great, summer destination. Would you agree, Ed?
I would, as I say, the toughest one, if you get into August, are icebergs. So if you want to see icebergs in August, I'm going to give you, I think I mentioned the 1st of July, I can usually see 3 dozen icebergs from my helipad at Carpoon Lighthouse Inn. By the 1st of August, I can see 2. So if you say icebergs are critical, we may get you in August, and you'd have to go all the way north. Don't go to St. John's. There's none there in August. You'd have to go right up by Lanson Meadows. And you got a 10 or 20% chance of seeing icebergs in August. If you want to see all 3, I'd come tomorrow.
And there's some questions about the pricing of the inn. Do you want to at least high level share something, or can you be more specifics in terms of, and is it all inclusive concept, or sort of like how does the lodging work?
The Southern Inn, Cape Anguilla Lighthouse Inn, is I think like 140 to 160, I believe. I don't even know. I own the company, but I don't keep track of the pricing per room. And that's your breakfast included. Supper is optional. If you want to come, then you reserve supper before you come, because we go down each day to the fish plant and say, okay, we need enough fish or lobster or whatever for 8 people tonight. And that's an additional. So yeah, like 150 basically, and that gives you breakfast in a room. Up north, it's more expensive because you're getting on a boat to go in, go out. All your meals are included. So you go out at 4 o'clock. Dinner is included. Breakfast is included. If you're staying 2 nights, then it's lunch, dinner, breakfast again, and the boat's back and forth. So that's $425 for a room, and that's for 2 people in a room. So all your meals, your boat's back and forth, and your room for $425.
Which is still very, very affordable to, with receiving all this, like amazing service, and you'll be staying in a spot that's, it's a prestigious Canada signature spot. So it's not just like any place that you wanted to stay, and that's what makes it unique. All right, I don't see any other questions, but if you have other questions, please reach out. But I wanted to add thank you again for taking the time. It was such an honor to have you explaining and showcasing Newfoundland, and taking us virtually with you to your beautiful hometown and home region. I personally learned tons of stuff. I thought I knew some sort of like things about Newfoundland. I learned tons of more. And again, I can't thank you enough. And I really hope that we all can come to Newfoundland and Labrador soon, hopefully later this summer. If not, we're gonna come next year.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Layla. It's happy. If I can't actually host tourists, it's nice to actually talk to some potential ones. It cheers me up.
Yes. And I guess one of the other things that I'm passionate about is also to support local businesses in local economy. And I guess we all need to do that more and more in Canada. I was actually listening to Peter Mansbridge, who was now doing a campaign with Explore Canada. And one of his messages, I forgot the exact figure, but it's like $26 billion or so that us Canadians spend for outside the country travel. And it would be wonderful if we just, spend that money, half of that locally in Canada. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. And again, thank you so much, Ed. Thank you all for deciding to spend your evening with us. And I hope that you learned something and we gave you enough inspiration to put Newfoundland and Labrador on your bucket list. If it wasn't, I hope it was. And again, thank you. Stay tuned for next week. We'll be exploring Canada for the next few weeks or so, because I think that this is a great country to explore. So thank you all. Have a great evening and take care all. Bye.